You were never his real wife, just someone who got lucky, my daughter-in-law said, smiling as if she had just shared a harmless joke, and my son didn't correct her, not even once. He just kept eating like those words didn't erase 36 years of my life in a single breath. I remember the sound of the fork against the plate more than anything else, that quiet, steady clink that somehow felt louder than her voice, louder than my own heartbeat. And in that moment I realized something I had refused to see for a very long time. I was no longer a part of this family, not in the way I thought I was, not in the way I had built my entire life around. I stood up slowly, careful not to let the chair scrape too loudly against the hardwood floor. I didn't look at her again, and I didn't look at my son either, because I already knew what I would find, or rather what I wouldn't find. No defense, no discomfort, just silence, and silence can say more than any cruel sentence ever could. I walked out of the dining room, past the hallway where framed photos still hung in perfect alignment, photos of birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, all of them telling a version of a family that no longer existed, or maybe never did. My hand brushed lightly against the wall as I passed, a habit I had developed years ago when I used to rush through the house preparing dinners, folding laundry, making sure everything felt warm and complete. Now it felt like I was walking through someone else's home, a place I recognized but didn't belong to anymore. I reached the front door and paused for just a second, not because I was hesitating, but because I needed to understand what had just happened, how something so deliberate, so calculated, could be said so casually, as if it had been rehearsed, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to be released. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the kind that usually feels refreshing after a long day. But that night it felt sharp, almost unfamiliar. I didn't cry, not then, not later, because the truth is what I felt wasn't sadness, it was clarity, the kind that settles in quietly and changes everything without asking permission. I walked down the driveway slowly, each step steady, measured, as if I were leaving something behind that I could never pick up again. And in a way I was, because what she said wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, a line drawn in a place I hadn't realized was already divided. I got into my car, closed the door gently, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular, just letting the silence settle around me. And that's when it hit me, not all at once but piece by piece, memory by memory, the small changes, the quiet exclusions, the subtle shifts in tone and behavior that I had dismissed as misunderstandings or stress or time. But now, seen together, they formed a pattern so clear it almost felt obvious. And the most unsettling part wasn't that she believed what she said, it was that my son allowed it, that he had been allowing it for longer than I cared to admit. I started the engine, the soft hum, filling the space where my thoughts had been, and as I backed out of the driveway I didn't look back at the house because I knew if I did, I might still see it the way I used to, full of warmth, full of meaning, and I couldn't afford that anymore, not after tonight, not after finally understanding that what I had been holding on to all these years wasn't real in the way I thought it was. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel lost, I felt certain, and that certainty was quiet, but it was stronger than anything they had taken from me. I drove for a while without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle into something I could almost hold, the streetlights passing one by one like a slow, steady rhythm, and for the first time in years I was not thinking about what needed to be done when I got home. No dinner to prepare, no dishes waiting in the sink, no one expecting anything from me, and that realization felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, because for most of my life my days had been shaped by other people's needs. I had always known where I belonged, or at least I believed I did, but that night, as I pulled into the driveway of the house I had lived in for over 3 decades, I hesitated before getting out of the car. The porch light was still on, casting that same warm glow it always had, but it no longer felt like it was meant for me. I stepped inside quietly, closing the door with the same care I used when the children were younger and already asleep, out of habit more than necessity. The air inside was still, untouched, and for a moment I just stood there in the entryway, listening, expecting to hear something, a voice, a movement, anything that would remind me that this was still my home. But there was nothing, only the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I walked into the living room slowly, my eyes moving across the furniture, the photographs, the small details I had arranged over the years without thinking, each one a piece of a life I had carefully built, and now, seen through a different lens, they felt like evidence of something I had misunderstood. I noticed then that a few things were not where they used to be. A framed photo from our anniversary had been moved from the mantel to a side table, slightly turned as if it did not quite belong in plain view anymore. A decorative bowl I had kept by the window was gone entirely, replaced by something newer, something I did not choose, and it was such a small change, so easy to overlook, but it carried a weight that settled deep in my chest, because it told me that decisions had been made in this house. Without me, that changes had been happening quietly, gradually, while I was still under the impression that I was at the center of it all. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom I had shared with my husband, my hand brushing lightly along the wall again, that same habit, and when I reached the door I paused, noticing that it was slightly ajar, which was unusual. I always kept it closed during the day. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside. And for a moment I just stood there, taking in the space, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway, the faint scent of the cologne he used to wear lingering in a way that felt almost imagined. And then I saw it, my dresser, the one I had used for years. Half of its drawers were empty, not completely cleared out, but shifted, rearranged, as if someone had started a process and then decided to finish it later. My clothes were folded differently, stacked in a way I would never have done myself, and on top of the dresser sat a small box I had never seen before, plain, unremarkable, but placed with intention. I did not open it right away. Instead I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, and let the realization settle slowly. This was not sudden. It was not a single moment of cruelty. It was something that had been unfolding quietly, step by step, decision by decision, while I was still believing in something that no longer existed. And as I looked around that room, I understood that what had been taken from me was not just respect, it was presence. I had been erased in pieces so small I did not feel them until now. And the most unsettling part was how carefully it had been done, how deliberately invisible it had been made to seem. I reached for the box then, my fingers steady, my mind clearer than it had been all evening, because whatever was inside it, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer going to ignore what was right in front of me. I opened the box slowly, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I already understood that whatever was inside would not be accidental. Nothing about tonight had been accidental. The lid lifted without resistance, revealing a stack of documents neatly aligned, too neat to be forgotten, too deliberate to be ignored. The first page was a printed email, my name mentioned in a thread I had never seen. The tone was polite, almost professional, but the content was unmistakable. Discussions about restructuring assets, about simplifying ownership, about making transitions easier in the near future. Phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried a meaning that settled heavily in my chest. I flipped to the next page, and then the next, each one adding another layer, signatures, notes, timelines, all carefully organized, all pointing to decisions that had been made without a single conversation with me. And then I saw Daniel's name, not once but repeatedly, his approval, his acknowledgement, his quiet participation in something I had not even been aware was happening. I sat there for a long moment, the papers resting in my lap, and I tried to remember when the distance between us had become this wide, when the little changes had stopped being temporary and started becoming permanent. I thought back to small moments I had dismissed, the times he cut our phone calls short, the way he avoided eye contact during conversations, how he would defer to Vanessa even on things he used to decide on his own. I had told myself it was normal, that people change, that marriage brings adjustments, but now those moments felt different. They felt like pieces of something much larger, something I had chosen not to see. I stood up and walked back into the hallway, the document still in my hand, and as I passed the living room again, I noticed more things that had shifted. Subtle but undeniable. Books I had placed on the shelves replaced by newer ones. The throw blanket I had kept on the couch folded differently. Even the scent in the air was different, lighter, unfamiliar, as if the house itself had been quietly redefined without me. I stopped in front of the large framed photograph near the staircase, the one taken on our 25th anniversary, Daniel standing between his father and me, smiling in that open, easy way he used to have. I studied his face for a moment, searching for some trace of the man he had become, or maybe the boy he used to be, and I realized something that felt both simple and difficult at the same time. He had not changed overnight. He had been moving in this direction for years, guided, influenced, shaped by someone who understood exactly how to shift things slowly enough that I would not resist. I turned away from the photograph and walked back to the bedroom, placing the documents carefully on the dresser, aligning them the way they had been when I found them, not out of respect but out of clarity. I was not going to react impulsively. I was not going to confront anyone tonight, because what I was beginning to understand required more than a moment of anger. It required patience, the kind I had practiced my entire life, but for the first time it would be used for myself. I sat down again on the edge of the bed, my hands resting calmly, my thoughts steady, and I allowed the truth to settle fully. This was not about one sentence spoken at dinner. It was about a process, a quiet removal, a deliberate effort to make me smaller, less relevant, easier to dismiss, and now that I could see it clearly, I also understood something else. If something could be taken piece by piece, it could also be reclaimed the same way, not through confrontation, not through pleading, but through careful, deliberate action. I looked at the door, still slightly open, and for the first time that night, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but a calm certainty that I had been underestimating myself for far too long, and that was a mistake. I was no longer willing to continue. The next morning arrived. Quietly, without any sense of urgency, the kind of morning that would have once been filled with routine, coffee brewing before sunrise, the soft hum of the kitchen as I prepared breakfast for a house that used to feel alive. But this time I did not move right away. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not out of exhaustion, but because I was listening to the stillness, to the absence of footsteps in the hallway, to the silence that now defined this space more than anything else. And in that silence I began to notice something different, something I had overlooked for years. How much of my life had been built around maintaining a sense of harmony that no one else seemed committed to preserving. I finally stood up and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the morning light in. It spread slowly across the room, touching the edges of furniture, revealing details that had always been there but rarely examined. And for a moment I simply watched, allowing myself to see the room as it was, not as I remembered it, not as I wished it to be, but as it existed now. And that clarity, though quiet, felt grounding. I dressed without rushing, choosing simple clothes. Nothing that required thought, because my mind was already occupied with something far more important, not what had been done, but what I would do next. I walked into the kitchen and noticed immediately that the arrangement had changed again. Small things, a different set of mugs placed near the front of the cabinet, a new set of keys on the counter that did not belong to me, and there it was again, that same careful pattern, adjustments made gradually, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a clear intention. I opened the refrigerator and found that even the shelves had been reorganized, items I used daily placed further back, less accessible, replaced in front by things I did not choose. It was subtle, almost polite in appearance, but unmistakable in meaning. I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the cool surface, and instead of reacting, I observed. I let the pattern reveal itself fully, because reacting too soon would only interrupt what I was beginning to understand. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and allowed my thoughts to move through the past without resistance. I remembered the first time Vanessa rearranged the living room, how she had smiled and said she was just trying to make the space feel more modern. I had agreed, even thanked her. I remembered when Daniel suggested handling the finances after his father passed, saying it would be easier for me, that I should not have to worry about those things anymore. I had trusted him without hesitation, without question, and now, sitting there with the quiet weight of that trust fully visible, I understood that none of those moments had been isolated. They were steps, carefully placed, building toward something I had never been invited to see. I finished my coffee slowly, not because I needed time, but because I was choosing it, choosing to move at a pace that allowed me to think clearly, to act deliberately. I stood up, rinsed the cup, and placed it back exactly where it belonged, not where it had been moved, but where I knew it should be. A small action, almost insignificant, but it carried a meaning that settled quietly within me. I was not going to disappear from this space without understanding it first, without seeing every piece of what had been done, and more importantly, without deciding what I would do in return. I walked back to the bedroom, the documents still resting where I had left them, untouched, waiting, and this time when I picked them up, I did not feel surprise or confusion. I felt focus, because whatever came next would not be accidental, not rushed, and certainly not guided by the assumptions that had once made me easy to overlook. It would be intentional, measured, and entirely my own. By mid-morning I had already read through the documents twice, not because I did not understand them the first time, but because I needed to confirm that what I was seeing was real and not something shaped by emotion or assumption. Every page told the same quiet story, ownership transfers outlined in careful language, account adjustments explained in terms that sounded reasonable but carried weight when placed together, and what stood out most was not what had been done, but how it had been done, gradually, politely, with just enough distance from me to avoid confrontation. I placed the papers back into the box and closed the lid gently, not with hesitation, but with a sense of completion, as if I had just finished reading a chapter that could no longer be ignored. I moved to the desk near the window where my husband used to sit in the evenings, reviewing paperwork or writing notes in his steady, deliberate way, and for a moment I let myself remember how he approached things, never rushed, never careless, always attentive to the details that others might overlook, and that memory settled into me with a quiet kind of clarity, because if there was one thing I had learned from him, it was that understanding a situation fully was always more powerful than reacting to it quickly. I opened the drawer of the desk and found what I had expected to find, folders neatly labeled, some familiar, others less so, and I began to sort through them one by one, not searching for something specific, but allowing the pattern to continue revealing itself. There were older documents, statements, records that still reflected a time when everything was shared, transparent, and then there were the newer ones organized differently, handled with a kind of separation that had not been there before. I noticed dates that aligned with changes I now remembered more clearly, small shifts in conversation, moments when I had been told not to worry, that things were being handled, that I should focus on resting, on taking care of myself, and at the time I had accepted those reassurances without question, because they came from my son, because they were spoken with a tone that suggested care. But now, looking at the evidence laid out in front of me, I understood that care can sometimes be presented in a way that makes it easier to take something without resistance. I sat down at the desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, placing it in front of me, and for a moment I simply rested my hand on it, not writing yet, just allowing my thoughts to settle into something organized, something actionable, because what I was facing was not confusion anymore, it was structure, and structure can be understood. It can be navigated, it can be addressed. I began to write down names, dates, accounts, not in a rushed or frantic way but carefully, as if I were mapping something out, each detail placed exactly where it belonged, and as I did, I felt that same quiet certainty return, stronger this time, more defined, because the more I saw, the clearer it became that I had not been careless, I had been trusting, and there is a difference, one that matters when it comes time to respond. I finished the list and set the pen down, looking at what I had written not with anger, but with focus, because this was no longer about what had been taken from me, it was about what I was going to do next, and for the first time since that evening at the table, I felt something settle firmly into place, not as a reaction, but as a decision, one that would not be spoken about, not yet, one that would be carried out quietly, the same way everything else had been done, but with one important difference this time. I was the one who understood exactly what was happening that afternoon. I left the house for the first time since everything had begun to make sense, not because I needed to get away, but because there was someone I needed to see, someone who would not speak in half sentences or careful omissions, someone who had known my husband long before any of these quiet changes had taken place. I drove across town without hurry, following a route I had taken many times before, past the same storefronts and intersections, yet everything felt slightly different now, as if I were moving through a version of my life that had shifted just enough to reveal what had always been there beneath the surface. I parked in front of a modest brick building, the kind that does not draw attention to itself, and sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, not out of hesitation but out of intention, because I understood that this conversation would not be casual, it would confirm what I already suspected, and once confirmed, there would be no returning to uncertainty. I walked inside and was greeted by the familiar quiet of a professional office. The receptionist recognized me immediately, her expression softening in a way that told me my absence had been noticed, and without needing to explain much, I was led to a small office at the end of the hallway where Mr. Collins was waiting. He stood as I entered, his posture unchanged, steady, respectful, the same as it had always been, and when he looked at me, there was no surprise in his eyes, only a kind of quiet understanding that made it clear he had been expecting this moment long before I arrived. We sat across from each other, the desk between us simple, uncluttered, and for a brief second neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already begun to take shape. I placed the box on the desk and opened it carefully, sliding the documents toward him without explanation. He glanced down at them, his eyes moving quickly, not reading for the first time but confirming something he already knew, and when he looked back up at me, he did not ask how I found them. He did not ask why I had come. Instead he leaned back slightly and folded his hands, his voice calm, measured, as he said that my husband had anticipated changes, not in specifics but in patterns, that he had understood how easily control could shift when trust was placed without question, and because of that, He had made arrangements, not obvious ones, not anything that would raise concern or provoke conflict, but something quieter, something designed to remain unnoticed until it was needed. I listened without interrupting, not because I was surprised, but because I was beginning to see the full structure of what had been left behind, something that extended beyond what was visible in the documents I had found. Mr. Collins reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk between us with the same deliberate care I had seen in my husband's actions years ago. He opened it and turned it toward me, and inside were papers I had never seen, accounts I had not been told about, instructions written in a way that required no explanation, and as I read through them, one detail at a time, I felt that quiet certainty deepen into something more solid, more defined, because what had once felt like loss was beginning to take on a different shape, one that included preparation, foresight, and a level of protection I had not realized was there. I closed the folder slowly and looked up at Mr. Collins, and for the first time since that evening, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not relief, not yet, but recognition, because what I had been facing was not as one-sided as it had seemed, and for the first time, I was no longer the only one who understood exactly what was happening. I left the office with the folder secured in my bag, not holding it tightly, not guarding it with tension, but carrying it with a quiet awareness of what it meant. The afternoon sun had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and as I walked back to my car I noticed how steady my steps felt. Not hurried, not uncertain, just measured, the same way my thoughts had begun to move. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, not because I needed time to think, but because I was allowing everything I had just learned to settle into place. It was no longer a question of what had happened, that part was clear. What mattered now was how I would respond, and that response would not be loud, it would not be immediate, it would be precise. I drove home along the same streets, passing the same familiar corners, but this time I was not simply returning, I was arriving with intention. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it had that morning, unchanged on the outside, quiet, composed, almost welcoming, and for a brief moment, I observed it from the car, not with longing but with clarity, because I understood now that what had been happening inside those walls was not sudden. It had been unfolding carefully, and if it had been done that way, then I would meet it the same way. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me, the same controlled movement, the same quiet presence. Nothing about my return would signal change, not yet. I placed my bag on the chair near the entryway and moved through the house as I always had, my steps familiar, my expression neutral, because what I was about to do required something I had practiced for years without realizing it, the ability to remain composed while everything around me shifted. I entered the kitchen and noticed immediately that someone had been there. A cup left in the sink, a chair slightly out of place, small details that suggested normal activity, and I allowed myself to move within that normalcy without disrupting it. I rinsed the cup, placed it in the dishwasher, adjusted the chair, not because it needed to be done, but because it maintained the pattern, the appearance that nothing had changed, and that was important because for now nothing needed to appear different. I walked back to the bedroom and set the folder inside the drawer beneath the desk, placing it beneath a stack of papers that had not been touched in years, not hiding it out of fear, but positioning it exactly where it would remain undisturbed. I closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the surface, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath, not to release tension, but to acknowledge what had shifted. I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me, I was preparing to act within it. I moved through the rest of the afternoon with the same steady rhythm, answering a call from Daniel with a calm voice, listening as he spoke about routine matters, his tone casual, unchanged, as if nothing had been said the night before, as if nothing had been revealed, and I responded in the same way, measured, composed, offering no indication that anything had shifted, because there is a certain kind of power in being underestimated, in allowing others to believe that their version of events remains intact. And as the evening approached, I set the table as I always had, placing each item with care, aligning everything just as it should be, not out of habit alone, but because I understood that sometimes the most effective way to change the outcome is to let the scene unfold exactly as expected, until the moment it no longer can. And as I stood there, looking at the table, I felt that same certainty settle once again, deeper, now more defined, because the next steps would not be reactive, they would be chosen, deliberate, and entirely my own. That evening unfolded exactly as it always had, and that was the point. The table set with the same plates, the same silverware, the same quiet attention to detail that no one had commented on in years, the overhead light casting a warm, even glow across the room, and when they walked in, nothing in my expression or posture suggested that anything had changed. Vanessa glanced briefly at the table, her eyes moving across the arrangement with that same casual assessment she always carried. As if everything in the room existed to meet her approval, Daniel followed behind her, loosening his tie slightly, his movements familiar, routine, and for a moment it could have been any other evening, the kind that blends into memory without leaving a mark. We sat down without ceremony, the chairs sliding softly against the floor. The same quiet sounds, the same controlled atmosphere, and as the conversation began it stayed exactly where they expected it to stay, surface level, ordinary discussions about work, about schedules, about things that required no real attention, and I listened, not because I was interested, but because I understood the value of letting people remain comfortable in their assumptions. Vanessa spoke with ease, her tone light, confident, the kind of confidence that comes from believing that control has already been secured, and Daniel responded in kind, nodding, agreeing, his voice carrying none of the hesitation I had once recognized, and I observed them both carefully, not with emotion but with clarity, because everything they did now confirmed what I had already learned, the patterns, the quiet coordination, the unspoken understanding between them. It was all there, visible in the smallest details, the way she would glance at him before speaking about certain topics, the way he would adjust his words slightly, aligning them with hers, subtle shifts that revealed a structure beneath the surface. And I allowed the meal to continue without interruption, taking small, measured bites, setting my fork down at the same pace, maintaining the rhythm they expected, because timing matters, and what I was preparing did not belong in the middle of casual conversation. It required the moment when certainty was at its highest, when assumptions were fully settled, when no one expected anything to change, and that moment arrived quietly, just as the plates began to empty, just as Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, her expression satisfied in a way that suggested she believed the evening had gone exactly as planned. I reached for the napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate, a small, deliberate movement that drew just enough attention without signaling anything unusual. And then I stood up, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the same calm I had carried throughout the entire day. I walked to the desk in the corner of the room, opened the drawer, and retrieved the folder, holding it lightly as I returned to the table. Neither of them spoke at first, their eyes following the movement, curiosity beginning to replace the ease that had filled the room just moments before. I placed the folder on the table between us, aligning it carefully with the edge, and for a brief second I simply rested my hand on it, not as a gesture of hesitation but as a pause, a space that allowed the shift to settle before it fully revealed itself. Then I opened it and turned it toward them, the documents laid out clearly, unmistakably, and I watched as their expressions changed, not dramatically, not all at once but gradually, the way understanding often arrives, piece by piece, Vanessa's confidence narrowing into something more focused, Daniel's posture tightening slightly as recognition began to form. And I did not raise my voice, I did not explain because I did not need to. Everything that mattered was already in front of them, every decision, every adjustment, every quiet step that had been taken without me, now visible, undeniable. And as the silence settled over the table, deeper than before, heavier in its meaning, I understood that the balance had shifted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more effective, clarity. And for the first time since that evening began, I was no longer the one being observed, I was the one they were trying to understand. The silence that followed was not the kind that fades quickly. It settled into the room with weight, stretching across the table and filling every space where casual conversation had existed just minutes before. Vanessa was the first to move, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift in her posture, her hand reaching toward the edge of the folder as if proximity alone might change what she was seeing, her eyes scanning the pages with a focus that replaced the ease she had carried earlier. And Daniel did not reach for anything at all. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on the documents, his expression tightening in a way I had not seen before, not confusion, not even anger, but something closer to recognition, as if he were finally seeing the full shape of something he had only understood in parts. I remained standing for a moment longer, then took my seat again, not because I needed to, but because the moment no longer required movement. Everything that needed to shift had already begun to do so. No one spoke, and I did not rush to fill that silence, because silence, when it is allowed to exist, has a way of revealing far more than words ever could. Vanessa finally looked up, her expression composed but no longer effortless, and when she spoke, her voice carried a careful tone, measured, controlled, as if she were choosing each word with precision. But I did not respond immediately. I let her words settle into the same quiet space, because this was not a conversation I intended to lead. It was something they needed to understand on their own. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hands coming together in front of him, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, and there was a pause in that look, a hesitation that had not been there before, as if he were trying to reconcile the version of events he had accepted with the reality now placed in front of him. And in that pause, I saw something change, not completely, not all at once, but enough to matter. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my posture steady, my expression calm, and when I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, even carrying no trace of accusation, because accusation was unnecessary. Everything that mattered had already been made clear. I told them that I had taken the time to understand what had been happening, that I had not come to conclusions quickly or carelessly, and that what I had found was not a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, one that had been built gradually, carefully, and without my knowledge, I did not raise my voice, I did not ask questions because I already knew the answers, and what I said next was not meant to provoke a response. It was meant to establish something simple and undeniable, that I was no longer unaware, that I was no longer uninvolved, and that whatever decisions had been made without me would now be met with decisions of my own. I stood up once more, not abruptly, but with the same measured calm that had carried me through the entire evening, and I closed the folder gently, sliding it back toward myself, not removing it entirely but repositioning it, making it clear that it no longer belonged solely to their understanding, but to mine as well. Vanessa said my name then, softly, almost cautiously, but I did not turn back immediately. I allowed a brief moment to pass before acknowledging her, and when I did, I met her gaze without tension, without anger, just clarity, and in that clarity there was something she had not expected, not resistance, not emotion, but certainty, the kind that does not need to be explained. I stepped away from the table and moved toward the hallway, my pace steady, my movements unhurried. And as I passed the framed photographs once again, I did not pause this time because I no longer needed to look back at what those images represented. I had already seen what I needed to see, and as I reached the end of the hallway, I understood something with complete certainty. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more deliberate, something shaped not by assumption or trust, but by awareness, and that awareness, once gained, could not be taken away.